Here on VisualPolitik, we've already made several videos about how Venezuela is going through its toughest times. However, we still need to address one of the most serious consequences of the Bolivarian Revolution's gigantic failure. And there's no debate here, Venezuela is adrift. With every day that passes, life in this country it just becomes harder and harder. With some of the highest violence, poverty, and inflation indices in the world, and with a growing drug trafficking and organized crime industry, many Venezuelans can't find any alternative to putting some space between themselves and their homeland. That is, leaving behind a country that's falling apart.
Venezuela tiene la fortaleza social, política, militar.
Well, if you were in a situation like theirs, would any of you have any hope? I mean, I would certainly try to escape. And that's exactly what more and more Venezuelans are doing, especially the youngest ones. Now, some of you might be wondering, well, okay, Simon, but how big is this problem in reality? Well, you see, according to the UN's calculations, from 2014 to June of 2018, around 2.3 million Venezuelans left their country. And these numbers, they're not going to stop from growing anytime soon.
Si van a hablar de migración, todos van a decir la misma cifra, que se han ido 50 millones de venezolanos, y todos repiten la misma cifra.
In other words, the Bolivarian Revolution has caused the greatest exodus in the history of Latin America. So listen up.
The Exodus.
Societies are entities in constant movement. Throughout history, migration has been continuous, whether for economic or for political reasons. To find better opportunities, to escape from a threat, or simply to escape bad living conditions, people are continually moving from one place to another. However, an exodus is something quite different. The term exodus refers to the mass emigration of people who are forced to leave the place where they live. That is to say, it isn't about people who dream of a better life, but people who have to leave in order to survive. In general, throughout history, the most common causes have been political, racial, or religious. Perhaps the most common type of exodus throughout history has been that by people forced to leave their homes because another, stronger group took over and expelled them violently. For example, there's the exodus of the Armenian people in 1915, when hundreds of thousands of people were forced to escape from the Turkish Empire, a process that became known as the Armenian Genocide. Another case would be that of the tens of thousands of Republicans who faced the threat of reprisal, torture, and condemnation of all kinds from the Francoists and were forced to leave Spain after the end of the Spanish Civil War. Or what happened in the Second World War, or with the fight for independence in African and Asian countries in the 1960s. Well, in our times, we've had two very clear examples. The first was a product of the Syrian civil war, which, since its beginning in 2011, has driven millions of people to move inside and outside of its borders. The second case is that of Venezuela, and everything indicates that its exodus will end up being much bigger than Syria's.
At this moment, the migration of Venezuelans should be described as a forced migration, as it's not planned, it's for survival. Beatriz Borges, Executive Director of the Justice and Peace Center in Venezuela.
Because, folks, we need to understand what's happening here. Understand that the hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who are escaping, they don't do it for pleasure, they do it out of necessity. And unlike the examples we've covered here, the Venezuelan exodus isn't the result of a war or the occupation of a foreign force, but of the hunger, fear, and the misery caused by the Bolivarian Revolution. You see, according to the Last Living Conditions survey in 2018, 87% of Venezuelans live in poverty and more than 60% in extreme poverty. These are sub-Saharan African numbers. The paradox is that this humanitarian catastrophe is happening in one of the most important oil powers in the world. Folks, the situation is beginning to get real serious. For example, due to a lack of medicine and health equipment within the country, diseases such as measles, tuberculosis, and malaria, diseases that had been eradicated in the country, haven't only re-emerged, in some cases they've become real epidemics. And what's more,
there are more than 100,000 HIV/AIDS patients at risk due to a lack of access to necessary medication. United Nations Office for the Coordination of Human Affairs
And of course, this lack of medicine has lethal consequences for the population. But that's not all. Venezuela is experiencing such a huge production and supply problem that it's becoming increasingly difficult to acquire basic food products. For example, a can of tuna can cost more than a minimum wage salary. That, folks, explains why, according to data from the United Nations, why Diosdado Cabello and the rest of the regime giants are growing fat on lobster dinners. Around 1.5 million Venezuelans are currently suffering from malnutrition. And then there's the violence issue, which is also no joke. Homicide statistics, for example, are at levels typical of a country in a civil war. Check this out. And then there's, of course, robberies, looting, extortion, and all the other crimes that have made this country a very dangerous place to live. And the Bolivarian police, they don't help. Listen up.
More than 40% of the crimes in July were committed by police officials. Venezuelan Observatory of Violence.
So faced with this scenario, we can't be surprised that just in the last 3 years, 2 million Venezuelans have left the country by sea, air, and land. Surely you've all seen the huge rows of Venezuelans walking step by step towards the border, because most of those who flee on foot sometimes take buses, cars, mules, but lately many have begun simply walking to Colombia, Brazil, and Ecuador first, and then maybe from there to Peru, Chile, or Argentina. And of course, this is not an easy trip. The journey is hard not only because of how tiring it is and because of what they leave behind, families, friends, and their homes, but in many cases, these refugees fall victim to fraudsters, thieves, and other nefarious characters. Fortunately, so far, the other Latin American countries have shown great solidarity and have allowed almost unrestricted entry to the hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. However, this could all change. Receiving so many people at once isn't always easy, especially if the recipients aren't exactly rich countries.
Huge pressure.
Folks, it's true. Some Latin American countries are beginning to feel a lot of pressure. The Venezuelan exodus is so great that in some cases they're facing serious capacity problems. For example, in the border state of Roraima in Brazil, the number of Venezuelans attending medical centers has increased from 700 in 2014 to more than 50,000 in 2017. Just in the first 3 months of 2018, the number reached over 45,000.
Every day, around 700 to 800 Venezuelans cross the border, and that's creating a lot of trouble for their vaccination and organization. Michel Temer, president of Brazil.
In Colombia, the number of Venezuelans already exceeds 1 million people. In Peru, there are more than 400,000, and in Ecuador, it's almost 250,000. The wave is so big that in 2018 so far, more than 4,000 Venezuelans have arrived in Ecuador every day. Of course, many of them go on to other countries like Chile, which in the first 6 months between January and June received almost 150,000 Venezuelans. All of this is causing the most affected countries to begin establishing some measures to reduce this huge flow of people. The Brazilian government, for example, has announced the deployment of the military at the border and has stated that it will consider establishing quotas, that is, a maximum number of people who can enter the country. For their part, Ecuador and Peru have begun to demand the presentation of passports. And why is that? Well, that's because passports are not exactly easy to obtain in Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela because, for one, there's a bureaucratic labyrinth, and also the simple fact that the government lacks the paper needed to actually print them. Oh, and then there's also the fact that because many officials do great business by selling passports on the black market, where a simple passport whose official price is only about the equivalent of 20 cents can cost between $700 and $5,500, depending on how quickly you need it or how much money the buyer has.
De fax news. Llaman así, ¿verdad? Fax o face. Yo de broma hablo español. Face news.
And for those who are lucky enough to already have a passport, when it expires, they can extend its validity for 2 more years with a stamp because they won't get another passport. But even so, getting that stamp, unless you go through the black market, can take up to 3 months.
Progresar, porque me han dicho que aquí hay muchas oportunidades y eso es lo que vengo, a progresar.
Anyway, That's the way things are. For the first time, Latin America is facing a serious problem with its borders. And it's not an easy problem. On the one hand, you can't prevent Venezuelans from coming in. It's a humanitarian issue, and there's still a huge margin of refugees to citizens. But it's evident that if things go on like this, more and more people will try to escape the country. And that's quite a challenge. Here, every Latin American country needs to work in a coordinated manner and receive support from the international community. Of course, to be fair, the effort and solidarity shown by many of the region's countries has been extraordinary. It's been an incredible example of Latin unity. And by the way, one final note here, it isn't only common Venezuelans who are leaving. In recent years, many Venezuelans who made a fortune during the Bolivarian Revolution's dark period, as well as the families of many high-ranking officials, have also left. And of course, they've done it with a full wallet.
Former ministers of Chavez hid 2 billion euros in Andorra. The opulent landing of Venezuelan millionaires in Spain. A dozen businessmen and former top officials, some of them detained for corruption, have invested tens of millions in luxury real estate and hunting ranches.
These are known as bola chicas, and we're going to try and do a video about them in the future. But for now, it's your turn. Do you think that the international community should help the Venezuelan people more? Well, leave your answer in the comments below as well as in this survey, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is made possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.